So, as part of our quarter of media in this season, we're discussing in episode 3 today about print media such as books. So, Brendan and I will be discussing, books we've read, books we'll be recommending, and things along those lines.
Yes, and today will be our third episode of our media series, just discussing media. And as Llewellyn said, print media today, the OG of the media. And yeah, we're just excited to jump into it.
Yeah, exactly right. So let's get into the show. My name is Llewellyn Fisser.
My name is Brendan Null, and you are listening to Finding Books.
Back for more this week. So, still in this quarter, we're talking about media. And on the topic of media this week, we're going to be talking about print media or books in that instance. I hope you've got something lock and loaded for our audience, Brendan. It's going to be...
Yes, I'm very excited to talk about books, especially paperback books, as reading is a thing I find myself doing on a regular basis. And as a starting point, talking about books and paperback books specifically, is that I found that there's a common analogy that, that paperback books have perhaps declined in popularity over the years. But actually, after doing some research, Llewellyn, I found myself that the figures have actually improved and that they're now constantly surpassing 650 million paperback copies sold per year, and that the paperback is still the preferred method of reading over ebooks. And I think the average US consumer of something like that, as like more than 60% of adults within the US have read a print book in the last 12 months, which I think is astonishing. I don't know. What do you think about these figures?
I mean, yeah, look, that's not bad considering the amount of book sales going up in the world. Like you look at an author like, Stephen King, who's renowned for his horror books. He's sold 350 million books across his career, man. So and he's written numerous books as well. At Pupil, It, The Shining, A Good Marriage. Like he's got a lot of great books. And yeah, I read recently that his body of work got acquired by Scribner and Simon and Schuster, something like that. They acquired the majority of his work. So yeah, look, even if you're not talking about paperback books, even like with Audible, you can listen to a book that's being narrated to you. Like that's become very popular recently. So, the fact that it's becoming more accessible to the everyday consumer, it's really amazing.
Absolutely. And I think specifically when you have a great and talented author, which has been proven himself for decades now, like Stephen King, which I find amongst his fans, which I am a big fanboy of, that there is really a sensational appetite around the content and, consuming Stephen King novels. Like I remember actually over December holidays, I bought another installment of the Dark Tower series from Stephen King, which is a series I quite enjoy. Like I didn't enjoy the movie, if we're talking about the film, because I think like they forced maybe too many books into one movie. But nonetheless, I feel like Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey's performances were very cool. And I think like a person like Stephen King is like, you can just write a novel and you can just like expect like a movie adaptation. How do you find the general feeling towards movie adaptations on books? Do you think they do them justice, or do you think like paperback or just books in general is the best format of media?
Well, on the topic of Stephen King, man, like, yeah, he does illustrate things in different ways than your normal everyday horror writer would. A lot of his stories take place in Maine, which is where he's from. So The Shining, which you like, it's in Maine. The famous It book takes place in Maine. So I think his work must be real personal for him if he's writing in the state where he's from, if he's basing these stories, these factual stories, in the sense that there is some history to the story itself, like a fictional history. But yeah, look, to put it quite simply, to answer your question about these movies being adapted from books, I saw this really cool thing where if you took a book as it is and you put a CD disc over the front of it, the disc covers the majority of the book, but not the entire book, which means that there'll always be content left out when you're making a movie. So I do think that there are a lot of instances where it's hit and miss with adaptations of books into movies, because the director or the producers are interpreting the book. It's not really the author who makes the movie as well. So yeah, you're putting a different mind in control of the outcome, which is a flaw in itself.
And now on the topic of Stephen King and movie adaptations, I think we can find a lot of times like the author would perhaps not agree with the way, I don't know, his book was portrayed in a specific film. As I think The Shining is a primary example of that, which I find I must a bit disagree there with Stephen King. It is probably one of my favorite all-time horror films, as I think I've established in our previous episode when we talked about movies. And I remember like he was very dissatisfied with the film, and he made like this mini TV series. It wasn't very good in my opinion, but still, nonetheless, the book and the movie, the Stanley Kubrick version, is by far one of the most influential, I think, stories in horror over the ages. And is there like a specific Stephen King novel that stuck with you?
Well, the only one I've read so far by Stephen King is the It book. But there is one that was recommended to me by someone I worked with. They saw I was reading the It book at the time, and they recommended that I read a book by Stephen King called At Pupil, which he described to me. It's about this kid in primary school who somehow becomes associated with a neighbor up the road from the school or from his house or something like that. And this neighbor ended up having a background tied to Nazis or something like that. So,
oh, yes.
Very, very interesting and broad concept there, which if that's tied in with a suspense or a thriller or even a horror genre, then I definitely remembered that book. I mentioned previously some movies and songs that I want to listen to but never do watch or listen to stick with me, and this is the book that's gonna stick with me until I end up going online and buying it. Like that's what I'll go ahead and do. How about you, man? Like what's a book that's really stuck with you?
Like specifically Stephen King or
just whatever
genre?
Yeah.
Well, I find myself like I'm not particularly a person that reads a lot of novels per se. I'm more of a person, I like books regarding, I know, science, inventions, physics, chemistry. I also really enjoyed reading books about philosophy, just really I find myself thinking, okay, let's get something, like a novel, maybe just to break the habit, just get some form of entertainment. I don't know. What about you when specifically reading like genres? But first, to answer your question, I think a book that I specifically like really enjoyed is, see, during high school I was never very scientifically orientated, like with classes and stuff. Like I had biology, which I quite enjoyed, but and later in my life, like post-matric, which I got an interest in things like physics and chemistry. And I think a book that really helped me get into the genre was by one Stephen King, which needs no introduction, which is A Brief History of Time, which I think was a very nice book. And I definitely encourage most people to read that. It's just like the ideas and everything he talks in it about the book about. It is just absolutely revolutionary. I've read many Stephen King books, and I think that one, it stuck with me. It's the ideas he has, the work he's put in there. it's just like literally a brief history of time from the beginning of time, what happened before time started, and like where is it going? Will the world end? Will there be a big crunch? Will we continuously continue expanding? You discuss things like thermodynamics. It's just an awesome entry level book for, I think, that for people that have a general interest in like physics and like just planets and anything like that in general.
Yeah, well, when you're reading books, is that the kind of genre you go for then? Do you like, this philosophical or
Oh
action
yes,
or
like philosophical. Like actually, we just I have a book which I am currently reading. It's a classic. I don't know if you're familiar with the author Fyodor Dostoevsky, which is a very prominent Russian historical figure. I don't know, like Russia right now is not particularly like a point, a talking point which you really can talk well about. But I definitely think I love Russian philosophy and books coming out of that age. And specifically, the book is named. I have a copy of it here. Is called Notes from the Underground, which is a great freaking. It's just a bunch of short stories from the author, but it's so deep in its philosophical meaning and what it brings to the table. Like, for example, there's tales in there of this guy that he sits in a what do you call it? A graveyard, and he could start hearing the spirits talking to him, and others about just this philosophical tale about like this man that lives in a house in poverty, an old man with a bunch of other old people, and once he passes they found actually that he chose to live that way, and like he had lots of rubles and money stuck away in his mattress. And, it's just small philosophical tales. You can take so much from a small short story like that. I still have to complete it, but I've read the fair share of the short stories. But I do love philosophy, man. Like not like Friedrich Nietzsche, Tolstoy. Like the route goes on and on. This German author Schopenhauer. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Also very deep philosophy. I think it definitely stretches from my background, as I had drama as a subject in high school, and I think a lot of times we dealt with a lot of things like like a lot of philosophy goes into it, and absurd theater. I love absurdity when it comes to novels and stories as well. Like books are like music, man. You don't particularly have one genre you always listen to. You have a bunch you try, man. And I think that makes us. And what about you? What do you read? Do you like novels? Do you like self-help books? Like,
really a bit of everything. Like I had this bookstore in town that sold all sorts of books, and they had a little cart out the front that had 3 books for $15. So I thought, okay, great, I'll just grab 3 books and read them, just see what's going on. One of those books that I grabbed is called Winslow Plain. Now, Winslow Plain is the name of the town. And basically, if I can read here, this book was published in the early 20th century. Like, it's a really old book. It's not so much a first published book. Here we go, 1903. And yeah, it's by Sarah P. McLean Green. And to make a long story short, Winslow Plain, it's hard to explain what it's about, but it's about the people in the town Winslow Plain. It follows mainly the story through a kid's eyes, and they go through this town. There's no antagonist. There's a couple of protagonists. There's some story there, but really good book all around that I found. Another book I bought is just plainly called Economics, because I'm also interested in economics and business. And this one is by a Partha Dasgupta. And this is just all about economy. So like, how 2 towns can have the exact same circumstances, but they will have 2 different social setups. So 2 different social norms and ways for people to think and interact. Another one here that my brother actually got me for my 20th birthday. It's by Jock Sarong. It's called The Rules of Backyard Cricket. And this was a really good one to read. It's about 2 Australian brothers who are both cricketers for the national Victorian cricket team. And it's one of those things, one brother's the loose cannon, the other one's the quiet, sensible one. And to make it simple, the loose cannon gets tied up in all sorts of wrong things. The book starts off with him being in the back of a trunk, shot in the leg, trying to break out. Like, really tense start to the book. But the one I'm currently reading, it's a mix of finance and self-help. It's a book by Tony Robbins. It's literally just called Money. And this is basically giving you steps to financial freedom. And some of the things I've read in this book about, how much do you need to be financially independent? Oh, some people will say, I need $1 million. I need hundreds of millions of dollars. He said, no, if you actually go ahead and work out your daily expenses, and everything that goes into your expenditure, you'll be surprised to find you only need 1/10 or 1% of what you thought. Me personally, after I worked everything out, if I want to be financially independent with the dream car, the dream house, all that stuff, all I need to make every year is $100,000. That's R1,000,000.
Oh,
That's all I need to make,
wow.
which is doable. Like when you start working, think of a salary. You get a salary. The average salary in Australia is between $50,000 and $60,000 per year. You're already halfway there. So that was a really good book to read. To answer your question, my genres are they stretch from fiction to non-fiction, man. But I haven't as such chained myself to an author yet. That's something I have yet to do. But yeah, like, do you follow any of the Audible trends lately? So we just listen to a book instead of reading it.
Not really, no. For example, like I find myself sometimes lazy to read, as I think most people do. For example, I have like a really thick book, you can take your time. It's not, I just think it's a lot to read sometimes. So sometimes I do feel, an Audible book would be nice, but I've felt myself over the years really being loyal to actually reading. Because I find myself, I can't get an Audible for my textbooks in which I study for university. I have to read, so I have to stay in practice. So even in my own time, recreational time, I just read paperback books. I sometimes read digital books, I must say, but never the Audible. And about you, do you like ebooks and stuff like that, or do you prefer paperback? And why?
Yeah, man. Like I tried getting into some online books. The closest I ever got to an online book was same as you, as at university. It was a textbook, and I didn't want to pay $100 for a textbook that I was only going to use for one semester. So I ended up downloading the PDF version of the textbook, and I hated it. Like I didn't like having the constant blue light strain on me, which sounds ironic.
Yeah.
It sounds very ironic because we watch television that has blue light. We have cell phones, that's blue light right there. I'm looking at you through a screen right now, that's blue light. But if you're cognitively linked to this screen and you're trying to focus on what you're reading, it's quite difficult. So even with Audible, if I want to listen to a book, I may as well just listen to a podcast. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
And if you think about it, like, isn't that what a song is? A song is just someone putting their emotions out to you, which is what essentially a book is. The same thing, but someone's narrating the book. So I guess you can argue they're similar in many ways. How much do you think books, or the accessibility of books, have actually grown in the last century? Like how the industry has changed, like.
I definitely think books, whatever your preferred format is, if it be Audible, digital, paperback, I think access has really gone up in terms of services you get now. I mean, I think you can get subscription services for books now these days, which they send you a couple books every month, which I think is something very nice that I'd like to explore in the near future or so. But I do feel like, in a sense, I know what the case is in Australia, but I think in South Africa, libraries are not that popular anymore. I think like a lot of libraries always close. As I think to myself, the library burned down near my hometown in Gordons Bay. Not the one specifically in Gordons Bay. It's more out of town, which I really like going to. That burned down, I know, a year or two ago, and there's still been no plans for reconstruction, which I just maybe shows the times we live in.
But in your hometown in Springs, where we met, one of the libraries just miraculously closed down as well. I don't recall why, but they did say it was closed until further notice. So yeah, it does.
And notice never came.
No, they further notice was the notice. So
that's true, man. I think I know like exactly the library you talked about. Like that's actually why I started out. I mean, as a kid, as a youngster, I've always wanted to read. I remember my parents always telling me tales, which I was very small before I could read and started school. I would always stare at books for hours. I could not understand or read a word, but like I really look at them and want to learn. And when I actually started learning to read, which I was 6 years old, I could read pretty much fluently. I was always at the library every weekend. That was my bread and not my bread and butter, but you get what I'm saying. That was my main pastime. I enjoyed that more than watching TV. I enjoyed that more than anything. And now it's for me quite sad how times have changed. I do still read, but I definitely don't read as much as I used to, which I was younger. And I mean, like speaking of adolescence and things like that, is there a specific book when you were younger, like you really enjoyed and like you have reread over the years and maybe like which just to you was defines like your childhood, man? Like, is there a specific book like that for you?
Um, there will always be iconic books that I'll
Mm.
find myself coming to. So when I was a kid, my parents they read some kids' books to me. They didn't do the whole lullaby, tuck me in, read me a story, good night thing. They still loved me though, but like that was just
I should hope so.
it's just different.
Only
So
your mother can love that face. That's why we're podcasting. So people don't really have to see them.
we also have a YouTube channel just for those listening. But anyways,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
no, I really want to read like all the critically acclaimed books. Like I want to read Moby Dick,
The classics, yeah.
The Art of War.
Ooh, I love that book.
Yeah,
San
like
Tzu, read that.
exactly. Like I really want to read these critically acclaimed books. But there's one book I guess I will find myself coming back to every few years. There's this one book called Circles in a Forest by Llewellyn, or it's a
Okay.
South African author, or in
Huh.
Afrikaans, it's Kringe in a Bos.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. I'm right away with the
so
novel. When you said like the Afrikaans like version,
yeah.
because you first said the English, I was like, what the fuck's he talking about?
That's why I said that, because there's an English adaptation of the book.
Didn't even know that.
But it's in it takes place in Knysna in South Africa.
Okay.
And it's just one of those books that defined a generation. So that's one book I probably will find myself coming back to. But this thing we were saying about libraries, man, I did think about that for a second, just to get back to it. When an author or a publisher sells a book to a library, they've essentially gained a customer and lost thousands of customers at the same time, because you can have that one book rented out to numerous people for, well, not for free, but the publisher doesn't receive payment when the library leases the books out to people. So you want to sell your books to libraries, but at the same time you really don't, man. Like I guess you can argue it's the same as when a musician sells a CD to someone, or if a movie sells a DVD to someone, like they've lost all future revenue. So for those people that own the rights to the book. But at the same time, and in a country like South Africa, where the infrastructure isn't where it could be with especially with a public service like a library, I do understand why they would close it down, because these books would not be returned, which voids the purpose of the whole leasing structure. It's a government initiative, so the funding is very low or non-existent. I mean, last year, between September and January, I was working across the road from a library in our town here in Albury. And every lunch break, I would go and do uni work or edit this podcast in the library, because I'd sit there, and it's so funny. I'd look at all the titles on the books. And some of them were just so strange. Like some of them were about climate change and how we can fight it. Some of them were about cooking. There was this one French desserts book. One of them had this title called, hung like an Argentinian duck. And I thought, what? That was a very, very strange title. So I Yeah, man, it's an underfunded industry. There's so much knowledge in that
Definitely.
one
Mm.
building, and it's being phased out. It's being avoided altogether. Um, but yeah, man, like, I guess another question I could ask is, do you think, then you said that books are the sales of paper or print back books are increasing. Do you think that's sustainable, with, if you look at from a corporate social responsibility point of view, books are made from paper, paper comes from trees. Do you think it's,
Mm.
trees take oxygen and kill carbon dioxide, which helps climate change? Do you then think it's just better to have everything digitalized now?
Yeah. Like, I think there's a lot of pros and cons that you can talk about. Like, personally, I doubt the sustainability of paperback in the future. Um, it's just about the environmental repercussions it has. That's one thing, but as well, we can move completely digitally, which we are in a digital age. But as to add on what you said earlier about the blue light, it's like I said, there's pros and cons to anything. Like, personally, for me, always the paperback book will be the king. It'll be all, nothing for me can ever beat that. But you have to ask yourself the question of sustainability and for how long we can continue it. But it's nice for me to know, like, you can go out, you can buy the paperback book, and it's yours. It is the physical thing you hold in your hand. It's your property. You can use it as you deem fit. I feel a lot of the times if you use like services, reading services and subscription services, you don't own that property, man. That thing is just there. It's a thing you read. But it's something nice for me about having a bookcase, and I think that's something I will always try for even the rest of my life. Even though how limited I imagined books would become available paperback, I'd always try to have something in my home. But yeah, man, like, definitely, like, getting back on the topic of the classics, man. Like, you have to have the paperbacks of the classics, even not being the first edition. I think that is the way it is meant to be read. Like, for when I was a child, I particularly enjoyed the book by H.G. Wells. I know you probably know it's Time Machine. It's a very old book. I think it was written in the 19th century. Very much enjoyed that. I did a book report on it in my first year at university. You could pick a book. But yeah, man, there's just something different for me about just going to the library, picking up a book, and sitting there and reading it, than just sitting here at my home on my tablet or whatever it may be, reading it. Is it sustainable? Probably no. But is it my preferred method? Yes.
All right. Well, then, as another final question to you, what's a book you'd recommend to someone to read, or what's a book that you think only you've ever read and that no one else knows about, that you'd recommend?
Well, there's this book that I read about 2 years back. It's not a very thick book. I think it's very informative and interesting. It's called The Accidental Scientist. It's Graham Donald. It just, it is what it is, The Accidental Scientist. It's just accidental discoveries. It's anything, man, from DNA to LSD to TNT, man. It's just incredible. It gives you historical background on it, how it came to be, and how we use it these days. I think that's one thing about me for books, which I like. I like informative book. I like to learn something from it. It might sound like a very nerdy thing to say, but that's way. Just give it a read, man. And for you, is there a book like maybe you can recommend for the listeners?
Oh, there's a book I bought for my friend about a few years ago that I heard about. No, it's the book about Shackleton's incredible voyage. It's called
Mm.
Endurance. It's by Alfred Lansing. Um, and if you know about Shackleton's incredible voyage, it's an infamous story. And I don't know, I don't know what the story is about. I just know that these men have their ship essentially freezes over on the Arctic Ocean, and they
Mm.
go to this island, and despite all these circumstances, not one soul was lost. I'm not sure if something happens on the island, if they all go Lord of the Flies on each other or not. But and what's really cool, and why I want to read the book even more now, is because they recently found that ship that I imagine the ship sunk. They found the ship recently, like I'm talking a few months ago. So now I'm like,
Mm.
great, that'll be a bigger emotional hinge to the book now, because I can say I was alive in the period where they found this boat. that sunk after reading the book or before, you know. So that's something I'd recommend people to get onto, and it's also based on, you know, this story. So definitely recommend it, man.
Awesome, man. Let's give that a look. And for the brave souls out there willing to see our faces, go check out our YouTube channel.
Yes, it's not the print media. This is all digital, this, by the way. But wonderful. That's another wrap for us, guys. And stay tuned, because next week we'll be back for another hot topic on media for you guys. So take it away, Brendan.
Boats and hoes.